classroom's always like very misleading. I was like, man, there's like no one here in an accountant. It's just like the layout of the room. So we got a lot more people than I originally thought would take part. So one thing to kind of point out, right, just to kind of, don't forget, we've got that second homework out there that's due at the end of the day, Monday, right? So hopefully, I can see who hasn't started, so I'm a little alarmed, but hopefully you've started working through this, kind of at least started on it early. You should be able to get kind of all the way through every single problem after getting through today's material. So, I mean, a lot of it you could have already started working on, you know, stuff we've talked about in the past, but after today, we'll have even the very last question covered. Other than that, are there any questions from me before we kind of jump into the material for that? Okay. So we've left off talking about surplus, price ceilings, price floors, like how we lose surplus, right? Deadweight loss, and the government comes in and kind of poses these restrictions. So I said one thing I want to start kind of giving you, kind of sprinkling in, is the labor market. So it's very different than the goods market, right? It's a little bit harder to think about. Okay? So we think about the minimum wage. The minimum wage is actually essentially setting a price floor. We'll think about why. So if we wanted to draw out the labor market, I'll kind of call this QL, or kind of the quantity of labor. So there's many ways to think about this. You can think about this in terms of like labor hours, total number of labor hours across every individual. We can think about the number of workers, right? For now, we'll think about it as the number of workers, because I think when introducing the idea of labor market, that's just the easiest way to think about it. Right? So as you kind of hire quantities of workers, right? You hire more and more people, you might have to pay different wages, right? So we're going to think about the relationship between wage and the quantity of labor, right? For that first worker, I might pay a much higher wage than for the next one, right? Because maybe I only need one or two workers. But that first worker is really, really valuable. And the second one's valuable as well, but not as valuable as the first, right? I hired the best person first, and then the second best person, and then the third person is a little bit less valuable because they weren't the smartest or the best, because I didn't hire them first, right? So what ends up happening is we have this demand for labor that's the exact same kind of idea as the downward sloping demand for a product, right? The only difference is when we think about producers and sellers, generally, I think we think about these as like companies, right? These big organizations. In the labor market, the people who are demanding labor are these big companies, these corporations, right? So it's kind of like everything's reversed in terms of the way that our experience kind of lines up with it, right? In a market for any good, right? Kind of a car, a desk, a expo marker, right? The producers and sellers are the companies. In the labor market, the companies demand labor, right? They're trying to hire workers. And then the supply of labor actually represents more so like you and me, right? We're the workers. We're the ones supplying our labor to these companies. So what ended up happening is we would kind of end up with this equilibrium quantity of workers and kind of just looking at, also the labor market isn't like every job, right? We're looking at a very specific job. And then kind of the equilibrium wage for that type of position, right? Since we're talking about the minimum wage industries in which this would be something that's binding, it would probably be something like a fast food, position at a fast food store. So, we might think about there's a pretty consistent or kind of equilibrium wage out there in order for these fast food places to attract workers, right? And it kind of levels out. Excuse me. So that we end up with this equilibrium wage for this very specific. So if I come in and impose a minimum wage, right? Let's say right now, I should just saw a sign. I think it was it. I don't remember what was that. Maybe it was McDonald's. I think kind of they said it was like 11% had it posted on the sign. Whatever fast food place it was that you can start working there at $11 an hour. Okay? So we'll assume we're just going to use that as our equilibrium wage. Well, if the government comes in and says, look, on $11 an hour, we still have a certain percent of people below the poverty line, so we actually are going to set this minimum wage up here at $15. So if that happens, what do we end up with in the labor market? A surplus or a shortage? at this wage, there aren't as many people that are demanding labor. Not as many companies now want to hire employees. They might switch out from employees and start to get things that are relatively cheaper, like, you know, fiat that people enter in their order, or some type of you know, what we call capital as opposed to labor. So quantity demanded is much lower than quantity supplied. As we raise that minimum wage, there's definitely going to be more people who are willing to work this specific job. So we end up with quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, or quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. So we end up having kind of this surplus. Right? There's more units of labor out there than are being demanded by companies. That's a problem. What is a surplus of workers? Unemployed people, right? This is not good. So, you know, this is the idea. We have these, here we kind of say this is a price floor, right? We can't charge a price below $15. Well, we were, right? So now we have to raise kind of the wage we're paying like this out. So the last demand for labor is going to be what sets kind of our new, we'll call this, I'll call it MW. Kind of quantity we get to because of that minimum wage. We think about where consumer and producer surplus. We said consumer surplus is here it's weird because the consumers are the companies who are consuming the labor. But that consumer surplus is going to be the area underneath the demand curve down to the price that these companies have to pay labor, down to that minimum wage. So here, this kind of red area represents consumer surplus. The blue area, right, is going to represent producer surplus, which is going to be the area below the price, right, that they're being paid, right? For the laborers, the wage is the price they're getting paid, but above their costs, which are represented by the supply curve, so above the supply curve, up to that wage, that represents to us producer surplus. And if you want to write these out, you can write producer surplus, consumer surplus. I'm just kind of shorthanding them with CS and PS here. So what we can kind of see here is, you know, before, without the minimum wage, for these individuals, the surplus was going to only be below this value. So now surplus for all these workers, right? This is the quantity of labor. So all these workers, instead of having only this as their surplus, goes all the way up to that $15 minimum wage now, right? So here, producer surplus is like, we kind of think about it as like probably a good thing, right? The workers have more surplus, more net benefit. That's all surplus is represented, is the net benefit either to producers or to consumers. Well, here the producers, right, or the sellers of labor are us, the workers. So for everyone who kept their job, they got additional surplus, right? Their net benefit was larger. This is great for them, right? This minimum wage worked for them. However, we lose out now because that quantity is lower on all this surplus, right? That green area is going to represent surplus that we lost because of this price floor or this minimum wage, right? So for the people who kept their job, their surplus went up, but for all these people, you know, they lost a lot of surplus, right? They don't have a job anymore. So, you know, the minimum wage, you know, there's an argument for, you know, a living standard that maybe minimum that we want to have in this country. But if we just start to impose minimum wages on these different industries, you can potentially end up with some people who are worse off, right? The unemployed people. The people who kept their job, you know, they're better off. The people who lost their job, obviously, lost surplus. Okay? And society as a whole lost surplus, right? That weight loss actually is above zero. Any questions on, I think.
So does this account for how does this account for people who are from countries that don't have minimum wage and thus the price, they're willing to work for like 25% less than that?
Oh, right. So if they can do it illegally, every person here, right? So everyone within this quantity range, their are companies that legally would have paid them above, would have paid them a wage above what they were willing to supply, right? Because their willingness, right? They would have supplied their labor for much lower than $15, like you're saying. So what has to happen is this has to be like enforced, right? The minimum wage has to be enforceable. If it's not, then you can have black markets exist, which is what we had talked about last class, which is regular goods. The only issue there is, I'm thinking about, and we could really complicate this, like if there are penalties for not paying someone the minimum wage, or paying them under the table, and you get, there's this probability you get caught, and then you get this fine imposed. There's an additional cost to employers. Remember, the employers are demanding labor, so that kind of reflects the marginal benefit to whoever, those companies demanding labor. Under the black market, they don't face this demand curve. It would actually be a much lower demand curve because it's going to be my marginal benefit plus all these potential costs, right, of getting caught. Right, so that would decrease. So it would decrease the demand curve for the black market employees, which it could eventually get pushed down far enough to where there's no one willing to pay you under the table, right? Which we know in practice isn't the case. Right? There are penalties, but apparently they're not large enough to lower that demand curve where on the black market there can't exist another equilibrium wage where the minimum wage is enforceable because they're not going through kind of the appropriate.
So then wouldn't effective minimum wage be directly changing the people?
So, right, you're anticipating a dynamic problem, right? So this is like in and of the moment today, static. Dynamic means what's going to play out over time, right? Well, if we set this minimum wage today, it's going to work, right? Let's assume that we've set fines high enough, there's no black market, right? This minimum wage today will work. But over time, what could happen is that the demand for labor increases, right? The products that, well, kind of jumping the gun a little bit, but demand for labor could increase for a variety of reasons, but we'll assume that it is because companies are prosperous, and so as we see more and more companies and kind of work higher and higher value, their employees have higher value. We see this increase in the demand curve, maybe like all the way up here. Well, now our new equilibrium wage is going to be something above 15. So when the government comes in and says, you have to at least pay your employees 15, I can look at them and say, yeah, I am. Right? So eventually, over time, a binding minimum wage could stop being binding. In fact, I would argue currently that's kind of the case. I mean, there are jobs that pay minimum wage, which is like in most states, I think, what, 730, I don't even know, 7 something. Right, 725, yeah. So right, it's a little, and it varies, state to state, but most jobs, like I said, you go out to fast food, I forget where it was now, you're going to at least get $11, right? So there's not a ton of jobs for which the minimum wage might be binding. And if we just set it the same for every industry, you think the minimum wage is binding for any type of engineering position? No, right? But it's binding for specific types of jobs. But you're right, over time, we have to adjust that, which is kind of the discussion that we're having now. Right, at least like, and when I say us, I meant the country, right? I don't think the minimum wage is binding in a lot of these kind of what we used to think of as minimum wage jobs, and so it's probably okay we kind of raise. Now we'll see some deadweight loss, right? But for the people that keep their jobs, that an increase in minimum wage would kind of benefit them. All right. Any other questions on them? I like these discussions. Hopefully, what to think about how this stuff actually applies to it. So I just kind of have to summarize what happens up here. We already talked about it. Quantity would go down, right, from this minimum wage. We get the workers who keep their jobs are better off. The ones who don't, right, we now have some unemployment and some deadweight loss from those individuals. Okay? Don't want to waste too much, or I don't want to spend too much time on that. They also want to think about setting quotas, right? So ignore the stuff I have over here on the y-axis for a second. A quota is pretty easy to think about. We're just setting a number of units that we're saying we can't see more than this quantity on the market, right? If we do, we're going to halt this, any more transactions at this point. So you could say, maybe I want to artificially kind of alter the price of the good. I'm basically just setting a quota and saying, hey, look, when I look out here at the milk market, you can't see anything more than 400 gallons. Anything past 400 gallons, the government isn't going to allow it. Maybe it, comes in and takes them off the market and just pours them out, right? Doesn't make a whole lot of sense for kind of the milk example, but potentially, right? And so just setting that quota, right? You know that individuals will be willing to supply that 400 unit at a price of $2. Consumers will be willing to pay up to $3, right? And generally, the way we think about this is, if it's kind of more of a bartering or bargaining or kind of going back and forth on the price could end up anywhere in that range. Typically, we think of producers generally have a little bit more power than consumers, and so whatever price consumers are willing to pay is usually the kind of price we tend to see that good go for when we impose a shortage, a quota, right? But ultimately, I just kind of wanted to show here that when we have this quota, we have the same area of deadweight loss, very similar to the price ceiling and price floor examples. Just another way the government kind of can come in and impose those restrictions. Instead of setting the price, right, setting price ceiling or price floors, they can come in and just establish what they want the quantity to be. And two different ways of getting at the same thing, right? When I'm setting these price ceilings, right, I'm ultimately, by setting a price of 30, I'm kind of choosing what the quantity will be on the market, right? So just a different way of doing the same thing. Whether I set the price or the quantity, I can kind of alter where the quantity in the market ends up. So we talked about price floors, price ceilings, and wages. I don't want to spend too much time on quotas. I'm not going to ask any questions on those examples for you right now. So the next thing we're going to move on to, we'll start today. I don't know if we'll finish completely, but Friday we can wrap up this stuff. So we're going to look at taxes. Okay? So for the sake of this introduction, we're going to think about what are called excise taxes. So they're taxes that are placed on the good when it's produced. I'll eventually show you it doesn't matter either way, but let's assume that the tax is imposed on the producer of the good. So if I, it doesn't really look like this. So if I produce something that has certain emissions, I might have to pay like a pollution tax or a carbon tax, right? So I'm taxing the producer. So we're going back thinking about goods here. So we've got demand, marginal benefit, supply, I'm representing marginal cost. So I've got my market before they come in and tax it, and I can identify the equilibrium. Here we'll call this Q1. So if I have taxes, I think we already kind of talked about this, but what's that going to do to my supply curve? Okay. So it's going to decrease my supply because taxes are essentially, I'm increasing my marginal cost. So at any given quantity, my marginal costs are now high, right? So I'm going to see this shift kind of to the left, right? Or a decrease in my supply curve because taxes are essentially just changing my input prices, right? Making it more expensive to make the same amount of goods that I was before. I now have to pay the same price to make them, but then also these additional taxes. So I see this kind of leftward shift in my supply curve, this decrease in the supply curve. My new equilibrium quantity, my new equilibrium price, you can kind of see the quantity of that good in the market will decrease and the price of that good in the market will increase. So we think about like when we pay, we consumers, typically like in practice, we only see that price that we have to pay. And so essentially when we're taxing the producers or the sellers, they're just passing, that price increase to them, right? They have to pay this additional tax. They're just passing it off to consumers, right? They're just increasing the price also. We can walk through the same thing, think about areas of surplus, deadweight loss, and I think I have a visual thing in the slides for that I kind of like. So, why do we pay taxes, right? You can kind of see up there. Well, if I'm producing a lower quantity, we said what deadweight loss is it's just the surplus loss, right? By not being able to kind of have as high of an equilibrium quantity as before. Right? So these taxes are definitely going to have some loss to society, But we think that, okay, yeah, we're getting some surplus loss in the market for cigarettes or something, you know, but we can take the tax revenue and spend it on things like public goods, roads, schools, you know, good things, the things that all of us can't buy on our own, but like collectively we can. Right? So, you know, there's lots of different types of taxes. Like I said, we'll kind of focus on this excise tax, which is just that if you produce this good, you're going to have to pay a certain tax for every unit you produce. Right? And they're pretty, we see this a lot, like alcohol, tobacco, gasoline. They all kind of have this tax in them, right? Kind of built in. You don't see it come up on your receipt, but right, the producers of these goods are taxed. That's an excise tax. Right? We're then also going to eventually be talking about, okay, now that we have this tax, right, who's going to bear more of the burden? Right? So we lost out on some surplus here, right? We've got some consumer surplus that we lost out on, but also some producer surplus. But which one was larger? Which loss was larger, the consumer surplus loss or the producer surplus loss? Right? That's the idea of tax incidence, right? The producers or the consumers lose out more, right? Lose out on more surplus because of this tax. We'll talk about how we can determine that. So if we have kind of a basic example about how taxes basically can be a hindrance to transactions, I'm not going to ask you to kind of reproduce this or anything, but just to kind of get us thinking about taxes. Let's say I had this individual, David, would pay $11,000 for his car. Matt would sell his car for $10,000, right? So Matt wants to sell his car for anything 10,000 or higher. David's willing to pay up to 11. They can come to an agreement, right? They've got $1,000 to work with there, where they can, you know, go back and forth and figure out a price that works for both of them. However, if there's a 15% tax on used cars and they're kind of going through the legal means, right? A 15% tax here would be about what? It's not right at all. Let's go. This should be 115. I can see that math is wrong. There we go. Right. So with that 50% tax, well, he'll pay the $10,000, but then, you know, 15% of 10,000 is another $1,500, right? So if the tax was this high on used cars, the price that he actually had to pay is $11,500. Well, now we can kind of see, you know, potentially get to a situation where, you know, he was willing to pay $11,000, but not necessarily saying he was willing to pay $11,500. So maybe now this transaction doesn't occur. So that's kind of the idea behind like why we're selling fewer units, right? Just like an individual level, right? If the tax is basically increasing the price, well, now some people who would have bought the good before are no longer going to be able to buy, or at least aren't willing to buy, right? So taxation can stop these transactions. We start out with no tax, right? We've got this equilibrium price. Hopefully by now we're getting comfortable identifying my producer surplus is the area below that price, but above my supply curve or above their marginal cost. And consumer surplus is the area below demand, but above the price. We start out kind of with this scenario. We come in and we tax the good. Right? So what ends up being true is that shift or that decrease in the supply curve, if we wanted to at any quantity kind of measure the difference between the point that we were at on that supply curve with the tax and the supply curve without the tax, that difference is just going to be the value of the tax, right? Because if the supply curve is representing marginal cost, the new marginal cost will be whatever it was before plus the tax, right? That's the only change that's occurred in the cost. Okay? So this increase in marginal cost kind of decreases that supply curve. So now that we have this new equilibrium point, it's a little bit different than with price ceilings and price floors. So we can identify the new equilibrium. You might think initially like, okay, here's my new price that I see in the market. Here's my new quantity. But it gets a little bit trickier. Okay? So this is what we're going to call the price that consumers pay. That is the price when you see someone, you know, go to a gas station, buy a pack of cigarettes. The price the consumer pays is kind of like the equilibrium price in the market. But there's another price we're going to start being interested in, which is, well, what's the amount of money the sellers get to keep? Because when you pay whatever it is for a pack of cigarettes, the company doesn't keep all of that, right? The because they have to still pay out kind of this tax, right, to the government. So if you give them $5 and the tax is $1, they only have to keep $4. So the way we identify the price that the sellers get to keep is, well, we know the difference between these two curves, right? The supply curve without the tax and the supply curve with the tax. The difference between those is just the value of the tax. So the price that sellers will get to keep is whatever the consumer pays minus the tax. So here's the price the consumer pays minus the tax, right? And this is the price that sellers keep. So at that quantity, where is the producer at on their own supply curve? That represents the price that the seller gets to keep. Another way of thinking about this is the price the seller keeps is the price the consumer pays minus the tax, right? So the price of the money that the seller gets to keep will always be less than what that consumer pays. So we can identify from that shift pretty quickly that new equilibrium price, or the price the consumers are paying. And then kind of at that new quantity, go down to your supply curve, right? Is the difference between the supply curve and your supply curve with the tax is just the amount of tax, right? So that price the consumer pays minus the value of the tax, and that represents the price that the sellers get to keep, or the money the sellers get to keep. Another way of saying that. Any questions on kind of this relationship between the price the consumers pay and the price the sellers keep, or any clarification? We're okay with this? Because I always think this is kind of tricky, right? Like, we've now got two prices that we're thinking about, right? Now, ultimately, the equilibrium price in the market is the price the consumers pay, right? But when we start to want to determine surplus, we no longer can keep using the same price for both consumers and producers, because remember, consumer surplus is like the net benefit to consumers. So the whole reason why the area was below the demand curve but above price is because, well, the demand curve reflected how much someone benefits from buying goods. The price reflected how much it's going to cost them, right? The difference between the two, it's almost like surplus kind of individual profits, almost. Right? Well, now for consumers, it's going to be the difference between their marginal benefit, or the demand curve, and the price that they pay. That's going to represent consumer surplus. While producer surplus, the price they get to keep is the good thing for them. So producer surplus will be the area below the price the sellers get to keep, down to the supply curve, which reflected their marginal costs. Right? So it's still going to be, we calculate surplus is just the difference between the benefits and the costs to the individual, whether or not it's a consumer or producer. But if we think about writing it out with more specific, for consumers, their benefit is represented by the demand curve. The price they pay is the price the consumer pays here, including the price of this excluded from tax. But for the producers, the benefit is that price they get to keep, or the money they get to keep from selling it. Their costs are represented by that supply curve. So visually, right? Consumer surplus is the area above the price consumers pay, but below my demand curve. Producer surplus was the area between the price that they get to keep, that sellers get to keep, and the supply curve. You can kind of imagine I'm losing out on these additional 250 units. I don't know what order I did this in, so I don't that's why I'm not going in. This is kind of the deadweight loss, that little triangle still. It looks similar to what we're doing with price ceiling and price floors. But we now also have some additional surplus, which is not to the producer, not to the consumer, but to the government, right? Because this area here represents, right, what's the difference between these 2 points was just the amount of the tax. So take the amount of the tax, multiply that by the number of units sold, and that's government revenue. The number of units sold times how much each unit was taxed. So kind of knowing the difference in those lines, right? The height of that rectangle is going to represent to us the value of the tax. The base, the length of this rectangle represents the number of units sold after the tax is imposed. So the number of units sold times the value of the tax is just government revenue. And then we lose out on this surplus kind of over here. That was kind of the loss from, we're no longer selling these additional 250 units. And so all that surplus is lost. Any questions over any of this? okay with this? We kind of had like a new party enter, right? Now it's like, just throw one more thing that we got to worry about, right? Producers, consumer surplus. We now also have this additional surplus from taxes, which is government revenue. Okay. Let's start to think about if instead of taxing taxing the producers, we tax the consumers. Right? So it really works the same way. It doesn't matter. Generally, the way I think of taxes when I draw them are these excise taxes, where I kind of see this decrease in supply. Because to me, it's very natural to think about, oh yeah, like a tax is just an increase in the cost to make something. Well, supply curves reflect marginal cost. That's just like a decrease in supply. My costs are now higher. I have supply less in the market. Okay. But if instead I thought about, okay, what if they come in and they don't tax the company? What if they use something like sales tax, right? That I, the consumer, pay that tax. Right? So if instead we start to impose the tax on consumers, what we'll see is a decrease in demand. Right? So we see this decrease in demand. Right? How much does it decrease? By the value of the tax, right? Because now the benefit to consuming that good is the benefit, whatever it was before, but then minus this tax, right? Because I have to pay this additional cost, right? So my benefits are a little lower. So that demand curve decreased. Well, now we think about, okay, where's that new equilibrium point going to be, right? We kind of identify that off the new demand curve, that includes the tax. So that hits my supply curve. Well, this is the price that's kind of put out there on the market, right? If I go to the store and I try to buy, I don't know, a gallon of milk or a loaf of bread or something in the store, I see, the gallon of milk is $1.19, right? Well, that's the price of the good on the market. That's the price the sellers will get to keep. However, when I go ring it up at the cash register, I don't pay $1.19. I pay $1.19 plus the tax, right? Plus this sales tax. So sales tax is a good example of taxing consumers. Another way of thinking about this is, right, the price the consumer pays will be the price that the seller receives plus this additional tax, right? So when we tax the consumer, the price we see in the market is whatever the sellers get to keep. And then when we go actually ring up the good, right, the total price we pay is that original price sticker plus the tax. Right? So it's just a different way of thinking about it. We still end up with consumers getting the exact same price as they were before, sellers keeping the exact same price they were before, right? It's just operating kind of from a different direction, right? So we think about consumer producer surplus is still the same. We still have the same government revenue. We still have the same deadweight loss. So it doesn't matter how we impose this tax, whether it's on consumers or whether it's on producers, we kind of get the same effects in this market. So, like I said, some goods we see, I think like there is still sales tax on things like alcohol and cigarettes, but the price sticker you see, that already incorporates this excise tax that was put on the companies for just producing the goods. When it comes to something like these I guess, what they call sin goods, like if I'm just thinking about clothing or something like that, the price that I see, because the tax is imposed on me, the consumer, the price tag I see is the price the seller gets to keep within the total price I pay, is that price plus the tax. Any questions on this before we keep moving on? Like I said, I suggest and generally we'll kind of use the supply curve or kind of show examples of the excise tax, but I did want to bring up that it doesn't matter who we taxed, we get very similar, or actually identical kind of outcomes. Okay? So let's say I want to analyze what's happened with different areas of surplus, right? So before, without a tax, here was these three parts made up consumer surplus. Right? The area above the price but below the demand. C, D, and F made up the total surplus for producers. What happens when we impose this tax right, is we end up with this new price that consumers are going to pay and the price that the sellers are going to get to keep, right? The difference between those two, value of the tax, right? So the new consumer surplus we said was this area A. So consumers lost out. Consumers lost out on area B and C, right? This whole area here. Producers now lose out on surplus that was here and here. I think it was D and F, right? Because now producers, this is new producer surplus, they've lost out in this entire area. So part of that consumer and producer loss of surplus was transferred to the government. Right? So the producers and consumers in this market kind of are both worse off. So let's think about cigarettes. This is why the government is okay, well, other reasons, but they're okay taxing cigarettes in the idea that you actually can hurt both the consumers, right? Make it, you don't want consumers to be consuming cigarettes. You also don't want the producers to be making them. So by imposing this tax, you reduce both parties' surplus values, right? You're taking what was consumer surplus B and what was producer surplus C, and that's now kind of representing that's tax revenue, right? You've extracted surplus from both the consumers and the producers as the government. And then, nobody gets, E and F, nobody gets that, it's deadweight loss. E kind of representing the consumer surplus that is now deadweight loss. F is the producer surplus that is now deadweight loss. So cursing, there's only one bad word, taxes, right? Overall, like these are, unless you think that the government can take this tax revenue and wisely spend it, right? We're kind of, society as a whole is losing out on quite a bit of surplus. All right. So we had kind of just, where I just walked through, I show you like some areas of producer and consumer surplus become tax revenue, some of it's just lost, right? So I also was showing, okay, if before the equilibrium price was $4, let me see if I have this here. Yeah, right. Notice I gave you, or I drew, like kind of gave you a visual of a representation where the old equilibrium price of $4, the new price that consumers pay is 50 cents higher, and the money that the seller gets to keep is 50 cents lower. So this would be a good example where what we call the tax incidence was born equally, right? So producers and consumers are kind of losing out equally, right? Consumers are paying 50 cents more, producers are keeping 50 cents less than they were before the tax. Okay? But a lot of times this isn't the case. Sometimes, in fact, you can see like, maybe the consumer has to pay $4 more and the producer only gets to keep like $1 less, right? It can be very unbalanced, right? So how can we determine who's going to bear more of that tax burden? Right? Who's going to be hurt more by this tax? So this is the idea of tax incidence. What would I want to do? Oh, there we go. I'll come back to this in the class if we have time. It's kind of an interesting kind of case study, kind of real world example. But I started talking about tax incidence, so that's where I want to go. So tax incidence, who's going to bear more of this burden, right, of this tax? So we've got the price the consumer pays, the price the seller keeps. And the difference between the two is just the value of the tax. So I can write that in either direction, right? Price the seller keeps, the price the consumer pays minus the tax, and vice versa. So who's going to end up paying more of this $1 tax, right? Who's going to influence the price the consumer pays more or the price the seller is keeping? So what we're really thinking about is that difference between the price the consumer pays and the old equilibrium price, and then the old equilibrium price minus the new price the seller is keeping. Which one of those differences is larger? So if I gave you some values like this, so I kind of use a gasoline tax one thing, and the value of the tax, actually you could tell me if you didn't put it up here. So looking at this black line is my original supply curve, the red line is supply curve plus my tax. What's the value of the tax here? Yeah, someone said it, $1, right? How'd you figure that out? So basically, I will look at the same quantity, right? And I'm going to look at the difference between where I was at on the supply curve and where I'm at on my supply curve plus the tax. Because the difference between those two is just the value of the tax, right? So here at a quantity of 30, the price was 150. Up here on my supply curve plus the tax, I would be at 250. So the difference in those lines is the value of my tax. My tax is $1. Okay. However, once I find these equilibrium points with my new supply curve plus the tax, I see that the consumer is going to pay $2.25, which means the price the seller gets to keep is just that minus 1. So the seller only gets to keep $1.25. Okay? So before, the equilibrium was $1.50. So who is hurt more by this tax? Or who bore more of the burden of this tax? Well, relative to before, consumers were paying $1.50, they're now paying $2.25. So how much more are they paying? 75 cents. Before, the sellers got to keep $1.50, they're now only keeping $1.25. So how much less do they get to keep? Only went down by 25 cents. So here we have a situation where the consumers were hurt way more. Their price they had to pay increased by 75 cents, while the amount of money that sellers got to keep only went down by 25 cents. So all we're doing there is comparing that new price the consumer pays and the new price the seller keeps. We're comparing that to the old equilibrium. Whichever one has changed more, they're bearing more of the burden. There's actually that tells us that they're going to have a greater surplus loss. Okay. Any questions on that? Okay with that? All right. So it's easier to think about determining who's bearing more of the burden. Well, who loses out the most, right? And here it's consumers, right? A little bit more than the producers. So let's, all right, we'll do a couple of these to make sure. Hopefully we're doing a little bit better than last class. So I'll walk through this and I'll have a few questions we'll kind of end out class here. So if I think about before, what was consumer and producer surplus? So that's just the difference between price, equilibrium price, and the demand curve represents consumer surplus. The difference between the price and the supply curve represents producer surplus. So I can find the height of this triangle, 90 to 50 is 40. I can find the base, it goes from 0 to 40. 40 times 40, it's a triangle, so then I have to multiply it by 1/2, right? Base times height times 1/2. That's just the area. We're just finding geometric areas here. Right? So I plug those values in, I get 800. I would get the same for producer surplus. Then after the tax, right? If I saw this kind of supply curve shift to where my new equilibrium price that consumer pays is $60, and the price the seller keeps then is 40. Right? My new consumer surplus would be this blue area, right? The area above the price the consumer pays, but below their demand curve. So the height of that is what? It goes from 90 to 60, so 30. Multiplied by the base of that triangle goes from 0 to 30. So 30 times 1/2, whoops, we get that $450 with it. We could then do the same thing for producer surplus, right? We're just finding the area of this little orange triangle. What would tax revenue be here? So what colored area is it going to be? Green. So it's a rectangle. So I just take the base times the height, or length times width. So the height is 20. 60 minus 40 is 20. The width goes up to 30. So 20 times 30, 600. And then what would deadweight loss be? We're looking for the area of that red triangle. Goes from 30 to 40, so 10. The height is 20. 10 times 20 times 1/2 because it's a triangle. And I get my deadweight loss to be 100. So let's see if kind of we impose this tax in the market. So assume I have, put the line there to make it easy, but that supply curve plus the tax shifts the supply curve backwards, but it decreases it. So that new price that consumers are paying is 70. What would the value of the tax be here? I'm telling you the price the consumer pays in the new equilibrium is 70. the price the seller keeps, looks like here is 45. It's going to be a $25 tax, right? The difference between the price the seller keeps and the price the consumer pays, that's the value of my tax. So that price the consumer pays is 70, the price the seller is keeping is 45, okay? So with all that kind of pre-information here, what would the value of consumer surplus be? So I'll give you a little bit of time to work on that, talk with the people around you, work with the people around you. Got 5 minutes left, so I'll probably give you like 3 minutes here to kind of work on this with the people around you. Once again, if you want some kind of help here, this quantity here is 50, 35, and the price the consumer pays is 70, the price the seller keeps is 45. Okay? So using those values, what is the value of consumer surplus here? You may not need all those values, just kind of in case you couldn't see them. I'll actually go for another 30 seconds here. Most of you are kind of getting an answer in here. Go to that 2-minute mark. All right. So if you haven't gotten an answer in, take your best guess. I'm gonna close it out here. So we got 32 of us. All right. Okay, so I should get $350, but why? Where is consumer surplus? Below the demand curve, but above that new price consumers pay, which is 70. So that little triangle up there goes from 90 to 70. So the height is 20. The base goes out to this quantity of 35. 20 times 35. But then it's a triangle, multiply by half, and I get 350. Here, I'm going to do one kind of ad lib it here. So A, I'll open this up in a second. A is that producers, and B will be consumers. That's how it looks. But A is producers, B is consumers. If I look at this graph, right, and the old equilibrium price was 60, the new price consumers pay is 70, the price sellers keep is 30, or what? Not 35, 45, right? Who bore more of the burden of this $25 tax, right? So did the producers bear more of the burden? That would be answer A. Did consumers bear more of the burden? And you would respond with B, okay? So the old equilibrium price was 70. The price consumers now pay, sorry, the old equilibrium price was 60. The price the consumers now pay is 70. And the price the sellers now get to keep is only 45, okay? So who bore more of the burden of this tax? A, if it was producers. B, if it's consumers. Okay. Kind of give a minute about getting towards the end here, but I want to mention something else after I close this one up. So A, if producers bore more of the burden. B, if it was consumers. All right. You haven't gotten an answer in. Take your best guess here. So 2 of us, make sure everyone gets their answer in. Thought we had 32. All right, I'm gonna close it out. So who bears more of the burden and why? It should be A, producers. Why?
The difference is greater by 5.
Yep. So consumers paid $10 more, but producers, 60 to 45, got to keep $15 less, right? So they're bearing more of the burden of that tax. So responses to those will kind of help me give me an idea of where we're at. Friday, we'll kind of wrap up talking about some government intervention. And I'll probably reevaluate exactly how far we're going to go kind of on Monday in class with new material. And then Wednesday, next class will be review for that exam, which is on Friday. Okay? Yeah. Yeah. All right. We'll see you guys on Friday. This one? Do you have any questions on it? Or oh, okay. Oh, are you looking at the slides? Yeah. Okay. So if you just view the slides and it's not in the viewer, like slide viewer mode, I actually just put white boxes. Oh, you're looking at the, oh, okay. Yeah, if you have the PowerPoint, open that one up. It'll look like they aren't there, but you can just move the white boxes out of the way, right? It's set to like animate slide. Yep. Thank you.
We had actually talked about carbon tax in planning this morning.
Oh, really? Yeah, because that one's imposed on